Hello and welcome to the Whiplash Reform Programme, the official injury claims session. We're just going to wait a minute while people join and we'll be starting shortly.
Okay, are we ready to get going? Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on the Whiplash Reform Programme. I'm going to give you a reasonably short presentation this morning on the Reform Programme, what it is, and our new online service, give you a bit of an update on how it's all going, and then most importantly, invite any questions and feedback from you all. So, with apologies to anybody who already knows all of this, I'm going to quickly talk a little bit about what the reform programme actually is. So a large part of the reforms are set out in Part 1 of the Civil Liability Act 2018 and subsequently implemented in secondary legislation. The overall objective of the reforms, or objectives I should say, is to reduce the overall number and cost of whiplash claims, the numbers of which were rising pre-pandemic despite roads which are safer and lower accident numbers. Now, the legislative measures include a definition for whiplash injuries arising from road traffic accidents, or RTAs, a fixed tariff of compensation for PSLA, or often known as general damages for whiplash, which depend on your prognosis, the length of your injury. It should also be noted that those tariff amounts can be increased by up to 20% in exceptional circumstances. And there's now a ban on seeking or offering to settle whiplash claims without medical evidence. So all claimants will need to provide medical evidence. Lawyers or claimants can't seek to settle their claims, and insurers can't offer to settle those claims without that medical evidence. Now, as you'll know, civil claims are allocated to one of three court tracks, and what we're most concerned with here is the small claims track, and the reforms introduce an increase in the limit for RTA related personal injury claims in the small claims track up to £5,000. This does exclude certain vulnerable road users, so if you're a cyclist, for example, or a pedestrian, this doesn't apply to you. So unfortunately, if you are, for example, hit by a car on a bicycle, you may have whiplash, but that's probably the least serious of your injuries, and your claim is likely to be more complex and higher value. What this does mean is that there are a greater proportion of RTA related personal injury claims. My apologies, that's a bit of a mouthful. They're going to get a greater proportion of these is going to go through the small claims track, where costs are generally not recoverable. So as a result of that, there was always a possibility that we're going to see a reduced demand for paid legal services and proportionally more claimants seeking compensation for their whiplash injuries without legal representation, which brings me to our new official injury claim service. And this is an online service developed by the Motor Insurers Bureau on behalf of MOJ, and it's to support claimants affected by these changes. And its use is mandated by a new RTA small claims pre-action protocol, and it's free to use. So it allows claimants to make, negotiate and settle their claims with or without legal representation. Now, they're still entitled to seek that representation, but as we've just covered, small claims track costs are not recoverable, so they may have to pay for that representation. OIC, official injury claim, can be used by both direct claimants and professional users, for example, solicitors, but also other representatives like claims management companies. But the key characteristic of the system is that you can use it as a direct claimant. So a lack of legal representation shouldn't be a barrier to access to justice. It's been designed with the claimant firmly at its heart so that it's straightforward, intuitive to use, and it's accessible. Now, despite most of life probably being online nowadays, we do acknowledge that there are going to be some claimants who can't use or don't want to use the online service. So it's also supported by a telephone service, the Portal Support Centre, where they can be assisted and to make their claim on paper. Now, the service is also supported by, move to my next slide, various guidance, which I will talk through briefly. So starting with our gov.uk page. Now this is primarily aimed at professionals, but hopefully it's useful for anybody that comes across it. It includes FAQs, information on fees, should your case go to court, and information on our advisory group, which I will come on to. Then we have the OIC guide to making a claim, and this is designed to support claimants as they go through the portal, and it's intended to be a bridge between the pre-action protocol and the digital service itself. Now, if you have seen the guide to making a claim, we know it's long, but it's not intended to be read in its entirety. It's meant to be a reference tool that you can look at appropriate sections as you require. Now, the guide is available from the official injury claim website, the portal as you're making your claim, or through the Portal Support Centre. Now, it's aimed at unrepresented claimants, but it may also be a useful reference for professionals and for advice providers. And it's also worth mentioning that this is not a static document. So as we learn more about what's useful, what kind of information claimants and professionals need, then we will update and refine and publish. We also have a third sector signposting toolkit, again developed by MIB in partnership with MOJ. And this is to support third sector advice organisations with signposting to the service. And that's either the digital portal or the call centre. We understand the concerns that have been raised previously about a potential increase in demand on these types of organisations. So this is very much aimed at helping you to signpost your clients to the service and not walk them through step by step the claim. And then finally, there is the OIC YouTube channel, and this includes demos of the service, animations, past webinars. There are videos here for both unrepresented claimants and professional users, and that's claimant reps and compensators. So, how is it all going? Well, I'm pleased to say that we have published data on the first quarter of operation. We did that a couple of weeks ago on the official injury claim website, and you can find much more comprehensive data than what I've got on the slide right now there. But at a high level, between the 31st of May and the 31st of August, so that's our first quarter of operation, there were 45,718 total claims, and obviously now there have been many more. Around about 10% of those were unrepresented claimants, and of those claims, 436 had settled as of the start of September, which is when we did the analysis on this data. Now, as you can imagine, this service is capturing a huge amount of data as claims process, and this is only going to get richer over time. The service is still relatively new, and figures are going to continue to change as claims progress through. And as we get a feel for different behaviours and trends, we of course look forward to continuing the open and productive conversations that we have always had with our stakeholders. And we're committed to monitoring this data and publishing operational data so that professionals in the legal sector, in insurance, in third sector can understand the impact on their services. As I say, it's early days, but tentatively, the data shows that the service is working well, with both unrepresented claimants and professional users using the service to progress claims. Now, it's important to consider this data in the context of data on settlement for represented and unrepresented claimants. So of those 436 settlements, for example, 96% of them were unrepresented claimants. And data on average settlement value, which we're not publishing at the moment because the sample size is too small, is also quite encouraging. Now, I'm going to keep saying this, it's really early days and it's too early to draw sort of firm and wider conclusions about outcomes, but we cautiously see the data so far as pretty positive. These are very early indications that don't at the moment demonstrate any disadvantage for unrepresented claimants. Now, I will talk about this 10%, this relatively low proportion of unrepresented claimants. Again, it's important to consider it in the context of what I just said about outcomes. We also think that that data shows that, as we anticipated, legal representatives are, and other professionals, of course, are adapting and proving capable of providing cost-effective services to their claimants. And so, therefore, a large number at the moment of these claims are still represented. Now, this is just a snapshot and early data anyway, but as I said, you can access the full set of data at officialinjuryclaim.org.uk, which is the OIC website. Now, a little bit on monitoring the performance and the impact. It all came into force at the end of May, but that's not case closed. We're going to continue to monitor how the service is operating, gather feedback so that we can understand how it's going, essentially, and make adjustments to the service where it's required and where it's feasible, of course. We really feel very strongly that this monitoring and feedback is absolutely vital to making sure the service continues to be operational, continues to work well for everybody. And we have a large and diverse pool of stakeholders who we continue to engage with post-implementation. We've also established an OIC advisory group, which meets quarterly, and we had a successful first meeting a couple of weeks ago. The membership of this group comprises a cross-section of the industry, across legal representatives, insurance, representatives from the judiciary, HMCTS, and also by design, a strong voice for unrepresented claimants and those who work with them, which is a really important perspective for us. Now, I've also already spoken about publication of data, but just to reiterate that it's not just monitoring of the performance of the service, but we're really committed to transparency in that regard as well. And we're also committed to embedding feedback mechanisms in the service to understand all users' experience, including and especially probably unrepresented claimants. So this is about getting virtually real-time feedback direct from users. So the obvious point would be when their claim exits the service, either through settlement or for other reasons. So if it's settlement, we might be asking them how their experience was generally. Are they pleased with the settlement that they've secured? Do they feel like it's fair? And for the latter, we'll probably focus on why they're not progressing their claim. And for both, we'll want to understand the sort of technical experience of using the service. But this is work that's ongoing, but we are definitely committed to embedding those meaningful and useful feedback mechanisms. And then in the longer term, of course, there's going to be policy evaluation, including a review, a statutory review of the tariff, no later than 3 years after implementation. Now, there is some pressure to do this early, so we've committed in Parliament to review the volume and the quality of data 1 year after implementation, so that's May 2022, to see whether there is enough to do a full review of the tariff. That's obviously not something that we know right now. We won't know what volume of cases will have gone through the portal by then, but we are open to undertaking that review if it's feasible. So I think I've probably spoken enough. And anyway, this is the most important bit, really, which is to get any questions from all of you watching the session and any feedback on using the service. So I think now I hand over to Laura, who has been keeping an eye on any questions coming in.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for a very interesting presentation about the injury claim portal. We've had some good questions already from the audience, and I'd encourage people to keep questions coming as we have quite a lot of time and we can try to get through as many as possible during that time. So a first question for you, Rachel, to kick off with. Are ordinary consumers going to feel the benefit of these reforms? think you're on mute.
Apologies for my technical
right.
ineptitude there. I muted myself and then couldn't seem to get myself off. Yes, in short, we very much expect them to. So you may have seen it sort of well publicised that insurers are set to make savings from this to the tune of 1.2 to 1.3 billion. And it is absolutely the expectation that those savings are going to be passed on to consumers. So partly that will be through what is a very competitive industry. You know, if insurers are not going to pass these on to their claimants, then their customers, even though they're going to lose that business. But just to be sure, it is mandated that insurers have got to report on these savings to the FCA and to, that's the Financial Conduct Authority, apologies, and to Parliament. So there is accountability there for these savings being passed on to consumers, absolutely.
Great, thank you. We've had another question from the audience about the third sector signposting toolkit, and it's about how this toolkit was developed, and if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, so this was developed in partnership with MIB, or at least they led on it really with input from us, and in consultation and with input from various different third sector organisations. So we had a specific programme of engagement with third sector advice organisations to understand how they anticipated the reforms impacting them and what guidance and information that they felt they needed. So it very much was not developed in isolation from the people who it was intended for. It's had the benefit, really, a massive benefit of input from the sector, as well as just from our brains.
Great, thank you. We've just had another question come in around the exit interviews, and if you'll be sharing the data from these exit interviews.
I think ultimately that is something we'd like to do. I think we'll need to, there will obviously need to be some thinking put into ensuring that there's nothing identifiable in data and nothing sensitive, and the usual considerations when you're thinking about sharing and disseminating data. But as with everything else, we're committed to transparency on this, and I think as it builds up and we start to get a picture of the trends, then that will be something that we include in our regular data publications, I expect. Yes.
Great, thank you. And just thinking about users actually in the portal, what happens if agreement can't be reached in the portal?
Yes, so sometimes that will happen, and what you may decide to do is go to court. Now there are various bits of guidance and support available for that, so it is covered a bit in the guide to making a claim about the sort of transition from the portal to the court system, and the portal itself will generate a court pack of the relevant forms to help people to start making that claim. So although you're sort of transitioning to a different system, if you like, moving from official injury claim to the HMCTS system, there is support and guidance to help you make that transition.
Brilliant. And could you talk a little bit about what the most challenging part has been of developing the new portal?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think, the whole thing has been a challenging project. It's moving from quite well established analog methods to a brand new complicated digital service, and that's always a massive undertaking. I think one of the biggest challenges, but also one of the sort of most interesting and rewarding things I think of any project is just all the different stakeholders that are involved here. There are lots of different stakeholders in the industry, both on the claimant and the compensator side, and also within MOJ and the justice system. And that's something that's always really rewarding when you try and bring all those pieces together, but is also a definite challenge as well. I want to, I've got my colleague Scott here, which I meant to, oh no, he's crashed, never mind. I I was going to ask him for his perspective as well, because he's been around much longer than me on this project, but unfortunately, technology has failed us. But hang on, I'm gonna switch my laptop right.
And we got the question as well.
Oh yes, one of the biggest challenges in implementing these reforms.
Biggest challenge in the reform? Oh, that is a good question. There have been many challenges. It's a lot of it is about assessing scope, who's going to be impacted, working out what those impacts are, how do you manage those, how do we improve them for how do we improve the system for everyone. It was a multifaceted project. It involved primary legislation, which was a difficult passage through Parliament to get the legislation in place, and once the legislation was in place, we turned to talking to stakeholders about how we can support them to use the new system, and that involved the development of what you see today in the official injury claim system, which was set up specifically to help people cope with the new system, to be able to follow the new rules without having to actually read an entire pre-action protocol, which I would never advise anyone to do, and to use it and to help people and support them through the process and make sure that they can make their claim if they need to, when they want to, at their own pace, and with or without help. Hopefully we've done that. Sorry, no.
I'm going to spin it back to me now.
Great, thank you. It's interesting to hear always about the challenges that are faced when putting something like this together. Just jumping back to some of the data that you presented, Rachel, could you remind us how many users were unrepresented, as there's been just a comment that 10% of users so far are unrepresented, which seems as a bit of a surprise?
Yes, so that's right. So and I'm afraid I don't have the exact number at the forefront of my brain right now, but of the 45,718, I've definitely thought about that number enough to have that memorized, claims in that first portal operation, around about 10%, so thank you, Scott, 4,331 claims were unrepresented. Now, on first look, you think, oh gosh, it's quite a small proportion, but what I would really impress upon people is that that's not the whole story if we're thinking about sort of claimant experience and claimant outcomes. So it doesn't necessarily spell bad news. What we also have to look at it in the context of is those outcomes. So things like number of settlements, the proportion of those settlements which is unrepresented, which at the moment is quite a high proportion, and also the speed with which they're settling and the settlement values. So and I think probably this caveat, this sort of not health warning, but the sort of word of warning applies to all data fields, which is nothing in isolation is the whole story. And actually that we've got this sort of 10% of claims being unrepresented, but we also have to look at the experience and the outcomes for those unrepresented claimants as well.
Great, thank you. And thinking about connecting this new portal to other HMCTS portals, are there any plans to connect this one to other HMCTS portals, such as the example that was given, CCOP?
Well, I think probably if you ask the Master of the Rolls, he would say absolutely yes. I think it makes sense to just think of it in the abstract. It makes sense to have everything linking up. Of course, then you have to start thinking about the practicalities and the cost requirements of doing that, and then it gets a little bit more nebulous and a bit longer term. I think probably that's the direction that the civil justice system is heading in. Do we have immediate plans to link with other services? Not right now. Frankly, at the moment, we're just focusing on bedding in our system and making sure it's working well and getting into steady state. I wouldn't be surprised if longer term there are linkages made with other digital services, but that's not the immediate plan.
Great, thank you. We've had a question from Mary from Law for Life around, will the online injury claim service be linking out to material from third sector organisations to help unrepresented claimants manage the liability and negotiation stages. So the example given was Advice Now has recently published a guide to do just that.
So I think the answer in theory, and that's sort of important, is we don't see why not. You know, we certainly don't think we're the last word on everything, and we know that other organisations are putting together guidance. But we also have to sort of think quite carefully about what we link to that's external, that's not government produced or that government has had an input in. You know, we have to make sure that it is accurate and fair and accessible and all the rest of it. So, you know, we have to consider these things on a case by case basis. So as I say, in theory, we've got no objections to signposting to other guidance, but we will have to sort of look at those quite closely.
Great, thank you. And another question just around the feedback you've had from stakeholders so far. What kind of things are people saying and what have you heard?
So I think in general, the feedback is, in terms of sort of using the service, the feedback is reasonably in line with what I've reported. There will always be those who were not in alignment, who were opposed with the reforms, and so we can always expect there to be some sort of policy critique ongoing. But in terms of how the service is actually working for users, I think at least the feedback that we've got so far is that it's going reasonably well. We do acknowledge that from a technical perspective, there have been a few bugs, a few teething problems. I think we would be very challenged to find any digital service where that's not been the case. A lot of it is coming from professional users who are wanting to integrate with the service. And we know that there are some areas that can be improved on there in terms of sort of timing of fixes and communication of those. And that's something that we're really regularly talking to MIB about improving on. But broadly speaking, we've not had any, and I should probably be touching wood here, we've not had any massive crashes, any significant outages. We had one very, very short one due to an expired certificate, I think it was. But broadly speaking, feedback is that it's working reasonably well, and I think that's borne out in the data as well.
Great, thank you. Jumping back again to think about sort of unrepresented users and the settlement number that you showed on screen earlier, we've had another question come in about that, that given that 90% plus of people are unrepresented among the settlement rate, does this flag any concerns about people settling too quickly without challenging early offers they might be getting?
I think that's a really valid challenge, and it's something that we are definitely alive to, and it's one of the things that we need to be keeping an eye on as we're monitoring. I also think that it's way too early to have a proper answer to that question, and that's probably what I know that's what I'm saying to a lot of things, and hopefully you don't feel like that's too much of a cop-out. But before we've got a larger sample size, and a better idea of average settlement values, we can't really say very much about whether those values are fair, and also we need to have a greater body of data on settlements for represented claimants as well, and then we can start doing a bit of a comparison and understanding the speed with which people have settled, the comparative values. So I'm afraid I'm not going to be drawn on that particular question in terms of is it flagging up concerns, but it is a really valid point, a really valid challenge, and something that we are alive to monitoring. But we simply don't have enough data at the moment to understand that properly.
Great, thank you for that. We haven't got any other questions in the Q&A, so unless there are any more, getting quickly. Otherwise, that just leaves me to say thank you very much to Rachel for a really interesting session, and also to Scott for jumping in as well to help answer the questions. And also thanks to everyone joining and asking some really interesting questions. And as is shown on the screen at the moment, don't forget that we've got a Q&A panel closing the event. So if you do want to submit a question in advance, there's an email address provided here where you can send some questions in and they'll be answered in the rounds. Well, thank you very much, everybody.